Hello and welcome to episode 22 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. I am your host, Bowie Madison. Today, we are diving into diabetes, insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's disease. So, looking to connect the dots between insulin resistance and what has now kind of softly been termed type 3 diabetes, loosely being connected to Alzheimer's and dementia. If we have not met, my name is Bowie. I have had type 1 diabetes for over 21 years. I have spent the past 2 years diving into the research, trialing and erroring on myself through supplementation, dietary changes, holistic health means, spiritual practices, what have you. And I'm sharing information as I go. So I started basically recording all of this and sharing what I've been finding, mostly via TikTok through short form videos and content. And it kind of blossomed into this longer form type stuff. And I'm having a blast. We're already at episode 22 here. I have experienced huge improvements in my health as a diabetic, my energy, strength, dietary, gastric issues, all sorts of inflammatory derived things some things I knew about, others I didn't until I started to address them. And I'm here to share them all. So let's go ahead and start talking about Alzheimer's disease and its connection to diabetes, because I think in 2016 or 2017, people started to recognize some of the connections between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. And it wasn't until about, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, that the term type 3 diabetes started to be thrown around without as much hesitation as it was before in the professional ranks, the research ranks, the medical ranks. So when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, it's understanding that one of the main issues in Alzheimer's is that the brain is not able to metabolize glucose quite as easily. They've targeted plaque buildup in the nerve cells and the neurons within the brain, preventing it from properly utilizing energy and, functioning properly. And this was 6 years ago now, but there were a couple different hypotheses that came out of this seeming connection between glucose metabolism and Alzheimer's. So one of the things had to do with high blood pressure. High blood pressure, if you don't already know, has a strong correlation with strokes and other altered brain function. Diabetes, one of the secondary symptoms of untreated diabetes is high blood pressure because of the elevated blood glucose levels stiffening and stiffening is the right word, stiffening circulating blood properly. So that was one hypothesis. The other came from the opposite direction. So a lot of times when people think of diabetes, they think of high blood sugars. The other possibility being thrown around at this time was the fact that hypoglycemia, and as being a causative agent, because if you're a diabetic, you have more control over what your blood sugar is doing. You are a lot more likely to experience hypoglycemic episodes as well as you become familiar with your medications. And they were hypothesizing that in a hypoglycemic state, these brain cells, these nerve cells, neurons were being starved, if you will, of glucose. And this was causing them to exhibit this kind of altered metabolism. And then people started to come around to the idea of insulin resistance. Again, the methods weren't clear, but insulin resistance having some sort of agency over cell metabolism in the brain itself. it was well documented, well recorded in other parts of the body. It had yet to manifest in the brain. So with insulin resistance, and we have covered this in previous episodes of the podcast, talking about the development of the disease, of diabetes, of insulin resistance, and some of the behind the scenes effects that precede the development of diabetes, but also occur downstream after the disease has developed as well. So you really have to wonder aloud, with insulin resistance that diabetics are experiencing, is it because there's not enough insulin being produced and the beta cells are dying? Is it too much insulin because it's resistant? Because our bodies are resistant, are our beta cells creating too much to overcompensate, right? And in both of those scenarios, not enough, too much, what are the downstream and upstream effects of having so much insulin around? Even further upstream, okay, maybe what's the inflammation that is causing this insulin resistance, and what are the effects, the simultaneous effects of that inflammation, as well as the abundance or lack of insulin, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about protein glycation and how cells' receptors for insulin can be modified in states of inflammation and insulin resistance. And then going along that line of inflammation, chronic inflammation being the root cause of diabetes, where is that inflammation coming from? One of my favorite lines that kind of like loops in my head is that when I hear other people or other doctors talk about inflammation as a diagnosis is fairly worthless. Like, unless you can pinpoint the where and the why, right? So you go with some issue that you're experiencing, and the doctor says, well, it's some type of inflammation. We'll see. We'll give you an anti-inflammatory and see what happens. That is the surest way for a doctor to technically be correct and have no idea what's going on, right? Like, why? Where is this inflammation coming from? And then on top of that, with this abundance of insulin or lack thereof, is there something else working alongside insulin that, that's kind of triangulating or working alongside, exacerbating the issues that insulin resistant brings about? You see this graph on the right-hand side. I have a more precise, this is kind of just a doodle I did trying to visualize it for myself. We'll do something more in depth on this later on in the podcast. So if you have not heard me talk about iron overload and the development of diabetes, I'll give you the quick synopsis. So insulin resistance is born, and this is all my opinion. This is not medical advice, all for educational purposes only. Insulin resistance is born of metabolic dysfunction leading to iron overload. This iron overload and ensuing metabolic dysfunction occurs as a result of systemic mineral imbalances, nutrient deficiencies, and pro-inflammatory additives in our food and lifestyles. The resulting inflammation resulting from iron overload causes structural and functional deficits in the beta cells themselves, as well as the cell's receptors for insulin, as we'll talk about later on. And this is not unique to beta cells. There are other cells affected. I talk about this in earlier episodes, going over iron overload and the effects on the body, the effects on the pancreas, the ties between inflammation and iron overload. So plenty of more resources going into that connection in earlier episodes. And I wrote a book on it, right? So this is just a quick plug here. So I dive into iron overload and its connections to a number of metabolic dysfunctions. I'm partial to diabetes because I have type 1 diabetes, but Alzheimer's, heart disease, arthritis, any number of autoimmune conditions, PCOS, Hashimoto's, Crohn's, IBS, all of it. All of them have ties to a very little known condition called hemochromatosis or iron overload, whether the primary or the secondary version of them. I talk about all of that in that book. That'll be linked in the description. So okay, Bowie, so, mineral imbalances, nutrient deficiencies, what do you mean? Am I not eating enough? What's going on here? So this is a chronic state of sustained malnourishment as a result of poor diet. And this is not just you and your diet in this lifetime. This goes back many generations, right? We're talking great-grandparents and grandparents here. Consuming processed food, enriched food, fortified foods that are enriched and fortified with nutrients without any context or without any appreciation for the greater web of other interacting nutrients. Okay, so one of the things that I have dialed in on is iron, right? An ironclad cause. That's the name of my book. Too much iron, not enough of the supporting nutrients causes iron to be stored in cells themselves, cells which are required specific mechanisms to handle iron. Iron is extremely reactive and prone to oxidation. This oxidation leads to inflammation, which leads to cell death and all of the kind of downstream effects of chronic inflammation. So you add in the fact that iron has been added to every single commercial grain since the 20s and the 30s. Over lifetimes, you're adding hydrogenated oils, vegetable oil, Crisco, safflower oil, sunflower, all of these pro-inflammatory, pro-oxidant materials, processed, bleached, added sugar, calcium, additives and preservatives that have no place in the human body. These are kind of accumulating over lifetimes, right? And in the process of taking those in, we have also whittled away the abundance of foods containing copper, all of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, as well as trace minerals, magnesium, natural plant compounds that also serve to regulate what we are being given too much of, things like quercetin or bicolin or any number of berberine, any number of natural plant compounds that serve to balance our system. We are living in a state of chronic imbalance, and that is what is leading to this inflammation. So what does all of this look like? And again, you're probably here to talk about Alzheimer's disease, and you're like, okay, Bowie, what does this have to do with the brain? You have to understand the inflammatory cascade and the root of that inflammatory cascade to really appreciate the process of disease development having to do with the levels of insulin, the levels of insulin having to do with the levels of insulin resistance, the levels of insulin resistance having to do with the negative effects on the brain. So hang in there with me. So what does it all look like? So iron-initiated inflammation disproportionately affects beta cells, leading to cell death and altered cell outputs. I talk about this in episode 12, 13, and 15 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. So we have this inflammation. It is targeting these beta cells because of the connection between glucose metabolism and the need for iron as a catalyst for glucose metabolism. So there is this initial jolt of inflammation, which causes, over time, progressive cell death. Because again, with what we're eating, we are not at all addressing the imbalances. We're actually furthering it and making it worse. So this initially decreases insulin output and structurally alters the insulin receptors in the cells. So we're losing beta cells without knowing it initially, right? This is kind of transient we wouldn't actually know that this was happening on the outside. We may start to overeat. We may start to put on, well, we won't put on weight till later, but probably overeating being the number one thing. And so this decrease in insulin is then recognized by the body as an issue, right? Because with this decrease in insulin, there is a increase in blood sugars, right? Because insulin is responsible for getting that blood glucose into the cell. So with not enough insulin, with this initial die-off of those beta cells, blood sugars are increasing. Now, the combination of those increased blood sugars and the chronic inflammation being brought about initially by the nutrient imbalances, the likelihood of glycated insulin receptors, and glycation is just the form of altering a cell's receptors functions, right? So you think of a lock and key. You know, if insulin is floating through the cell like a key, the lock on the cell comes in, gets into the lock, and lets glucose through. Glycation kind of gums up the lock so that the key can't get in. And so here I'll go back to that diagram that I drew up. So protein glycation, once it's kind of gummed up and not able to receive insulin, the receptors are altered. This is what we consider insulin resistance, right? So on the right, you'll see that black line, which is kind of just trending down from the beginning. That is the beta cell mass. So you'll see in that first half of the graph on the left-hand side where the beta cell mass initially decreases, right? The blue line, which is signifying the insulin amounts being made, coincides with that beta cell mass naturally, right? So if you're losing beta cells, you're losing the ability to create insulin. Now, when you hit this certain threshold where the body realizes, oh my God, I am hemorrhaging beta cells. I need what beta cells I have left to kick it into overdrive. So now you have the remaining beta cells that are alive and well, creating insulin at levels to compensate for the initial cell death caused by the inflammation, right? Now, that transient increase in insulin, a compensatory mechanism, is what is bringing about, in my humble opinion, bringing about the conditions of type 2 diabetes that everyone is familiar with, right? Obesity, heart disease, kidney failure, all kinds of things. So again, we'll get into this, that graph in more detail in just a little bit. So for starters, that inflammation caused by iron overload, caused by nutrient deficiencies, is leading to a decreased beta cell mass. Our beta cells are being killed off. Simultaneously, while we're losing beta cells, our blood sugar goes up, inflammation's still there, and this is blocking and altering the insulin receptors on the cell, leading to insulin resistance. So now, here's that graph kind of on steroids here. The loss of beta cell mass leads to that compensatory release, you know, that kind of blue loop there in the middle of the screen, the compensatory release of extra insulin from the remaining beta cells. Now, what does that mean? Now, with all of that insulin in circulation and its inability to do what it's supposed to because the receptors on the cell are also blocked up and aren't able to effectively use the insulin just stays in your serum, right? It's just hanging out in the blood, not able to do what it's supposed to do. A secondary feature of insulin in states of excess sugar is to store that sugar as fat, right? So in that chronic state of inflammation where beta cells have started to die off, insulin levels initially decreased but now are increasing, but sugar is still unable to get into the cell. That extra insulin takes that sugar in the bloodstream and stores it as fat, right? We know that huge correlation between obesity and type 2 diabetes. People just assumed for the longest time that if you were overweight, you developed type 2 diabetes. But what if it was insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes that led to obesity? Food for thought, right? So you'll see here at that critical threshold, insulin, the critical threshold for the compensatory insulin production, insulin resistance effects are exacerbated. This leads to increased weight gain, right? Because your body's producing more insulin that isn't able to do its primary job, so it does its secondary job, which is store fat. So this also decreases our feelings of satiety or feeling full, right? This kind of makes us stay hungrier even when we don't really need food, because technically our cells aren't getting the food that we're eating. So once that insulin increase starts to happen, that is clinical definition of type 2 diabetes, right? You've got that increased insulin volume in the blood, decreased sensitivity to the insulin, the continued inflammation of those nutrient deficiencies. Your beta cells just keep dying off, right? Keep dying off. That's what the inflammation is doing. And your fat mass increases, which there's plenty of research on now. That exacerbates the inflammation, makes the inflammation worse. And it's honestly just this big, bad, positive feedback loop that just keeps piling on. Now, there comes a point where you've just lost so many beta cells that your body is not able to sustain itself anymore. That is type 1 diabetes, right? So once your beta cell mass hits the point of no return, like your body can't survive with so few beta cells and so little insulin in your system, you're diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, right? So your fat stores, that's why all type 1s usually at diagnosis are incredibly skinny, right? Because your fat stores have been completely depleted via ketosis, ketoacidosis. Your body isn't able to effectively use sugar at all, so it starts metabolizing body proteins and fat. You can't metabolize glucose at all. All right, so a lot to chew on, and again, I've hardly touched on Alzheimer's yet, but we'll get there, because as you'll see, with more insulin in the cell, decreased sensitivity to insulin, more fat storage, increased blood sugar, and that last one, amylin production. Amylin is a huge, huge factor in the development of Alzheimer's. So, sweet amylin. Pancreatic beta cells, most people don't know this, don't just release insulin. They also release something called amylin. Insulin, as we know, is used to get glucose into the cells. Amylin is used to help pace the food going through our digestive system to more effectively use insulin and prevent any spikes or dips in our blood sugar, right? So if I eat this whole meal down into my gut, is it just like, I chew it all, it's in my stomach, and then it just gets thrown into the small intestine? That would be a huge rush of sugar into circulation, right? And our pancreas would have to be throwing insulin out like crazy. Amylin is kind of serves as I love the garden hose analogy here. So it kind of serves to slow the spray of sugar into our system, right? So amylin is what makes a diabetic feel full so that they'll stop eating and give their body enough time for the food to be processed through the small intestine so that insulin can be secreted at a proper rate to keep your blood sugar level and prevent spikes and dips, okay? So amylin is incredibly important. And another factor for diabetics that most don't know, if you are type 1 diabetic and a developing type 2 diabetic, you are losing your production of amylin. So your sense of fullness coming from meals, I know I've experienced this my whole life. I get hungry very quickly after I'm done eating. That has since changed since I've started to manage it on my own. But and when you do eat, that food is just shot right through your stomach. As your stomach's done digesting it, it dumps it right into your small intestine where it's absorbed into the blood. So you're needing insulin quickly, right? So many doctors now are prescribing like, okay, just take this lump sum of insulin at the beginning of a meal. And that works because they're just eating their meal and it's going right into the blood. Whereas if you had amylin production, it's going to slow you down. It's going to slow the release. It's going to slowly drip that food so that the insulin can work effectively. Meanwhile, you feel full and you don't want to eat anymore, so you're not making it any worse. So that's what I think is probably the most unaccounted for byproduct of insulin resistance and that huge increase in circulating insulin. It's the overproduction of amylin, because as we'll see, and amylin has a couple different names. So when you look it up in the research, I'll have some titles here for papers. You need to make sure that you know all of its names. So amylin is also called islet amyloid polypeptide, or IAPP. It's even shown in some papers as HIAPP, which just means human islet amyloid polypeptide. There are some experiments using rat or rodent IAPP. It's all kind of based on amylin. But of note, remember, beta cells make amylin and insulin. So in that transient stage of too much insulin, there is also too much amylin. And amylin is prone to aggregation. And aggregation just means kind of clumping together. Now, that's a problem because amylin aggregates have been shown to be disruptive to cell function. They disrupt cell membranes. That there's a huge misfolded proteins, right? A lot of people know misfolded proteins in epidemiology have a lot to do with the development of disease, because it's like you're getting instructions, but the instructions are all crumpled and you're not able to actually make what the instructions are asking for effectively. But with this abundance of amylin causing amylin aggregation, they actually form plaques that are comparable to the beta amyloid plaques being found in Alzheimer's patients. Okay, so that's the big tie there. So you'll see here, human islet amyloid polypeptide, a therapeutic target for the management of type 2 diabetes. Now, people are focusing on amylin for the treatment of type 2 diabetes to help manage hunger, to help regulate blood sugar, while simultaneously the research is also acknowledging that IAPP, or amylin, is also very similar in form and function to the plaques being formed in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. All right, so this is from the NIH. Amyloid plaques form in the brains of people who have Alzheimer's and can lead to problems with brain function. All amyloid plaques begin as strings of amino acids called amyloid beta peptides, or AB peptides. Now, let's think about what I've got this graphic here. This shows basically what a beta sheet or an AB sheet, alpha beta or amyloid beta peptide looks like. So I like the word plaque just because it's a little bit easier, kind of, like plaque in your teeth, plaque in your brain for Alzheimer's. These beta sheets are like plaque in your brain cells, preventing them from functioning properly. Now, the plaques around your brain cells are made up of these amyloid sheets, which are, in essence, aggregates of these amyloid fibrins. So we've got a lot of different research going into the connections between the beta sheets found in people with Alzheimer's disease and the amylin aggregates that are a byproduct of people experiencing diabetes and altered glucose metabolism. So the general thought is that this insulin resistance and the resulting aggregation of amylin is an accomplice to the development of Alzheimer's disease. Because in that state of insulin resistance, because insulin, there's so much insulin in circulation, there's so much amylin in circulation, and neither of those are able to do what they're supposed to, they kind of go off and do their own thing. Insulin is taking all that sugar that it can't get into the cell and it's storing it as fat. So people are becoming obese. Amylin aggregates to form these amyloid plaques, which make their way up to the nerve cells in the brain. Now, important note, because you can get lost on this slide when really we talked about before, all of this is happening in a state of chronic inflammation being caused by nutrient deficiencies of the food that we're taking in. So not only is that inflammation continuing, causing these conditions to occur, but once the new conditions occur, the insulin overproduction and the amylin overproduction, the byproducts of those are even furthering the inflammation happening. So it is just piling on the sources of inflammation in the body. And as you can tell in our healthscape right now, we're kind of drowning in it. We don't know how to get rid of all this inflammation. So this is kind of like a breeze through graphic, a summary, basically a summary of kind of everything I've run through. So could Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia be caused by prolonged insulin resistance? I say yes. So step one, nutrient deficiencies leading to iron overload. This could have happened with your great-grandfather. This could have happened with your grandfather. It just keeps passing down. Not only are we passing genes, but we're also passing on the cellular environments, right? So if your father and your mother are nutrient deficient, you do not magically just have everything you need when you're born, right? All of these deficiencies and imbalances accrue generation after generation. So with these deficiencies and these imbalances come chronic low-grade inflammation. It just so happens that iron overload, which is one of the major deficiencies and imbalances being inflicted by the food that we're eating, targets beta cells. So the beta cells die off. It leads to beta cell ferroptosis. Ferroptosis is a fancy word for cell death by iron. Okay, so beta cells are dying off. Insulin resistance is increasing. We talked about that on the graph before. This leads to that overproduction of insulin and amylin. An overproduction of insulin and amylin leads to amyloid plaques, right? Too much amylin, it aggregates and sticks and blocks the nerve cells from being able to, or the brain cells, neurons, from being able to do what they need to. It exacerbates the beta cell die-off and makes diabetes and all of the associated metabolic dysfunction even worse. Both of those things, the amyloid plaques and diabetes, and all of that kind of autoimmune type stuff, negatively affects our brain cells' ability to metabolize glucose, which furthers dementia and Alzheimer's along the way. And I mentioned before, just in passing, that amylin aggregation does not just affect neurons and brain cells. It also makes things worse for the beta cells themselves, right? So there's a paper, Kiriyama and Nochi. I'll include that in the link in the description as well if you'd like to read. The amylin aggregates in islets in beta cells further the inflammatory damage happening to the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, all of the organelles responsible for the cell living, right? So this is kind of like death from the inside. So, this has not been the most uplifting of podcast episodes. Hang in there, because there is something that we can do as people experiencing insulin resistance, as people with diabetes, as people interested in taking care of, brain health. Again, none of this is meant to treat, cure any diseases. This is all educational. You have to do your own research. These are the things that I am doing and experiencing success with. But there are natural compounds found that limit the toxicity of amyloid aggregates. I've got the title of the paper below. They focused on two compounds, alpha lipoic acid and absorbic acid, or vitamin C. So you could ask yourself, well, what, okay, great. Alpha lipoic acid and vitamin C, where do I get those? The best place it can come from is your food, right? People are so conditioned to jump for supplements. And supplements can be helpful. You need to be very, very cognizant of where your supplements are coming from and what else is in them besides the advertised product. Food is the best place, right? So broccoli, spinach, red meat, organ meat, Brussels sprouts, tomatoes, peas, brewer's yeast, all very, very rich in alpha lipoic acid. Okay. Absorbic acid, right? Everyone's so familiar with vitamin C. Again, food is the best source. I do not want everyone just going out and getting emergency. Emergency is trash, right? You need to be aware of how your vitamin C is being sourced, what it is mixed with, and how that affects the effects of vitamin C. So obviously citruses, orange, kiwi, lemon, grapefruit, strawberries have even more vitamin C than an orange, bell peppers, tomatoes, your cruciferous vegetables, and white potatoes. Go figure. Of honorable mention here is also copper. So copper has been studied independently for its ability to affect the ability of amylin aggregation to form those beta sheets that cause the plaques in brain cells. Okay? Copper has been shown to inhibit the formation of those beta sheets, of those plaques in brain cells. Ironically enough, and I say this tongue in cheek because I don't think it's ironic at all, copper acts opposite iron. I talked ad nauseum about the effect of iron on the development of disease. Copper acts opposite iron, right? We're iron overloaded. Copper helps in so many different ways. This is just one of them. Okay. So eat more organ meats, more shellfish, fish, nuts, seeds, chocolate. Look for copper rich foods. That's what I did. I supplement as well. I've got links for those in the description, but it's all there. It's all there. It's all there. Alpha lipoic acid, vitamin C, and copper. Useful tools in managing amylin aggregation. Definitely worth a look. Okay, so this, again, a lot of information. It needs to get out there. It needs to get talked about. The research is there. You saw the paper titles, and again, those aren't the only ones. But people know about this. They're just not talking about it. It's just not being shared. It needs to be shared, and who better it to come from than someone experiencing the disease itself. Okay, so keep learning, keep sharing, keep experimenting. I've got all of my links. I've got a nutrition guide. I've got a supplement guide. I've got supplement brands that I use that I trust, as well as the link for my book, An Ironclad Cause, that talks about everything iron related, copper related, disease development related. Okay. So again, this is episode 22 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. I am your host, Bowie Madison. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.